Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis, LA and dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello, Daniela.
Hello, Daniela Lamas. This is Dr. Daniela Lamas I'm speaking with, who is a critical care doctor at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. It's a pleasure to have you on the Quarantine Tapes. Thank you so much for taking my call. It's so important for me to speak with doctors who are on the forefront of this virus. I've been speaking with philosophers, I've been speaking with filmmakers, I've been speaking with people who run homeless shelters, but to have your view is tremendously important. So I'm very grateful to be speaking with you. Can you tell me what do your days consist of now? With this virus at the hospital where you are practicing doctor?
Yeah, so my days are either sort of alternate between a feeling of sort of holding my breath and waiting, being at home and not on call, alternating with being in the hospital. And so I'm in Boston, and right now, in the start of April, Boston has not yet had its surge. And I say not yet because I'm told that it will, but I guess I should just say not because we can't actually predict. But we've started to become busier, but the hospital, our hospital particularly, has not yet exploded or has not exploded. And so what that means is that our division of pulmonary and critical care medicine has created all sorts of schedules, different teams, different colors. There's an orange team and a purple team and a whole rainbow of teams that are going to be quote unquote activated at different times depending on how many patients you get. And we haven't yet had, so about half the teams have been activated. And so I'm going to start working in the coronavirus specific ICU next week. But it feels funny because, and by funny I mean uncomfortable, because today I spent actually sitting at home, haven't gone outside, have been working on papers and such things at home, while I also see my colleagues in New York City suffering, and wish that I could be there. Part of me wishes it, but then I'm conflicted, and part of me is happy to be safe. But given that there's an anticipation that in Boston things will get worse, we're asked not to leave the city. So I am here waiting and seeing what happens.
But Dr. Lamas, I would also say that in many ways, the extraordinary virus we're living through now, your work has been, in a sense, a preparation for this.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying, and based on my half question, how might you respond?
Yes, very much so. I feel that we are preparing, and I am preparing. I mean, I've been in the ICU. I was in the ICU for much of March, and in the general medical ICU before our hospital sort of separated things into a corona-specific ICU. And so I had patients with coronavirus. One who sort of stands out in my mind particularly, but took care of others who we thought might have had it, ended up being negative. Some had it. And becoming familiar with sort of the pathophysiology, becoming familiar with all of the changes to our ICU that are sort of unique to this time, particularly the fact that while I was there, we made the shift from the usual ICU standard of practice where families are all about, they're on rounds with us, just for their loved one, obviously not for everyone, and they're like a really integral part of the team, really. Their contributions are key. I was there when we made the decision, when the hospital made the decision. We had to tell people that they couldn't come back again because there are no more families. And now there are no more families in the ICU. So sort of I've seen this shift to this kind of new world. And now we're waiting to see what happens. But yes, we feel more prepared, and I feel more prepared, having been in the unit, having taken care of coronavirus patients. You can't prepare for numbers that you're unequipped to deal with, but you can prepare. You can prepare to be the best equipped you can be, and I think we are.
But in a way, also what I was trying to allude to is that you've worked so much on the traumatic effects of having spent time in an ICU department, as it were, and then going home, for patients going home and finding themselves lost, finding themselves isolated, finding themselves alone. And you've tried in many ways to bring about a better understanding for doctors of how they might work to remedy this kind of trauma that patients feel. And I remember so many years ago having the great opportunity of interviewing Atul Gawande based on an article I had read of his, which just devastated me, and I wrote him a fan letter of the kind that I'm sometimes I feel an urge to do. You remember that piece in the New Yorker called "Letting Go." It was such an extraordinary piece, and in many ways, your two recent extraordinary articles in the New York Times spoke to me in ways that are not dissimilar, which is so many patients now, because of social distancing, because you can't see them, you can't really talk to them in the moments when they are suffering the most and when they might need a lending hand. Actually, you talk about the fact that you're not really able to touch them, partly because you're scared.
Yes. I mean, all of that is so true. And thank you for that kind words and kind comparison. And yeah, there's definitely has been so much loss and shift of trying to figure out and preparing to figure out how to be a doctor in this kind of new framework where those moments that defined your interactions with these other people, a hand on a shoulder, a smile that was visible because you could see somebody's mouth that wasn't hidden behind a mask. Those are gone because of the really clear and pressing and not controvertible, external realities of this virus. But it feels very odd, and we're both preparing, and I'm preparing myself to kind of understand this, while also knowing that there's no real preparation that can be done because it's very dark, and we try to bring in iPads, these sorts of things, look something, but when it comes down to it, people are sick and they are scared and they are alone, and families are separated and quarantined and alone, and that's the truth. And technology is great, but still the truth.
Dr. Lamas, your recent piece, which I was mentioning a moment ago, is so extraordinary that if you don't mind, I want to read a paragraph from it. It came out about a week ago. It's called "I'm on the front lines. I have no plan for this." And you talk about a patient who is with their wife, I believe. And this is the last time they will be able to see each other because of the necessity of social distancing. And I will read this, and I have to say it's pretty tough to read. I read it to my own children. It's really quite extraordinary. I think it's tremendously important for everyone to hear this at this moment. But now, as we tighten our protocols to protect our patients from the threat of COVID-19, she's alone, here in my hospital, as in so many others throughout the country. We've banished most visitors. It's a tough decision that leaves our patients to suffer through their illnesses in a medical version of solitary confinement. And I'm worried for them, because those of us on the front lines simply don't have plans for this. The isolation is, of course, even more profound for those who are infected with or being evaluated for coronavirus. I took care of one such patient who was intubated when he started coughing up blood on the general medical floor. He was alone in his room on FaceTime with his daughter when it started. So that is the last image she has of her father on a shaky computer screen, blood staining his hospital gown. I offer her updates over the phone, but the truth is that I'm not sure when she will be able to see him again. Extraordinary. Extraordinary what you're living through and the predicament you find yourself in front.
Yeah, and it's extraordinary what these people are in, right? Like people who just, have the misfortune to be sick, either with coronavirus or with something entirely other. As it turns out, this gentleman that I wrote about, turns out he doesn't have coronavirus. He ended up being negative.
Really?
But his daughter still couldn't see him because of the hospital rules. Yeah. So it's for everybody. People are going through, their own catastrophes and tragedies that maybe are about coronavirus, maybe aren't. And they're living these tragedies out alone, and they're living through this. The gentleman actually ended up doing well. He was extubated. The breathing tube came out early this past week. He still hasn't seen his family because he's still in the hospital and he still can't get visitors. But before the breathing tube came out, the night before, we were starting to wake him up from the sedation. He was waking up. He was with it. He knew that he was in a hospital and there was a breathing tube down his throat, and he was displeased. And so we called up his daughter and his son and put them on speakerphone and stuck the phone next to his ear, slightly deaf, and they screamed, "I love you, Dad. I love you, Dad." And he clearly heard them. And that would have been great, as an ending image. But he gets an even better ending image, which is that the next day the tube came out. He's left the ICU and goes to the general medical floor. And so I don't know. I wrote that it was not when, but if she saw her father again. I feel like it's now a when. She will see her father again. That was pretty dire news these days, and so that was a bit of positivity that I enjoyed, at least.
And in a way, what you've done so beautifully now is update your own article, which had such a resonant quality to it. It made it really put us, like Atul does so well, in that moment where in that same article you talk about the fact that you'd love to touch that you're the kind of doctor who would love to touch the hand of your patients to comfort them, but you can't, and you say, "I can't, I'm scared."
It's true. It's true, I am. I just coughed while we were talking, and I've had a cough for a day or two, and I haven't, I'm not going into hospital till next week, and I'm feeling okay, and, there hasn't been a reason yet to get tested for coronavirus, and it's just a cough, right? But you have these moments of panic. You have the moments of panic at home. Is this a cough, just a cough? Am I suddenly short of breath? I go on the treadmill to make sure I can still run, a quick couple miles. Yes, I can. Not short of breath. We'll be okay. And you feel that in the room. If I breathe this air, am I potentially doing myself harm? Can I go faster? Is there a reason to do this part of the physical exam? Am I just following through this protocol because it's the protocol I've learned, but is it necessary here? And with that, and it's for dual purposes. It's fear for oneself. There's also the real and sort of practical need to conserve personal protective equipment, PPE. If you can avoid going into the room, well, gosh, then you've avoided reusing masks currently and eye protection, but you've avoided using a fresh gown and at least 2 sets of gloves. So there's many incentives to limit the number of times you go into a room. And then once you're in there, there's really the only thing keeping you from staying for a while is the fact that you're scared. And also, patients who are sick enough to be in the ICU with coronavirus are often intubated. Their lungs are quite fragile to the extent that they need at least 2 sedative drips to keep them sort of from doing more harm to themselves on the ventilator. And so they're deeply asleep. But it's a different way of being a doctor, for sure. It's one where fear is pervasive, and fear wasn't there at all. Not fear for my own fate, fear that I was making a mistake or that I wasn't doing the right thing for my patients. For sure, I feel that often, but the idea that you'd also be scared for yourself is entirely foreign to me.
In another piece in the New York Times that I think came out yesterday, which is called "What If We Have to Decide Who Gets a Ventilator?" the kind of description you have in that piece reminds us of Sophie's Choice. Patients who are speaking to you and in some way trying to impress you that they are worthy of getting a ventilator. Can you describe the kind of really ethical situation a lot of doctors find themselves in now at this present moment? And, in the end, who will be apt in some way to make that decision, which seems to be such a terrifying one to make under any circumstance?
Yeah. So, as a critical care doctor who's going to be taking care and have been taking care of these patients, it seems quite clear that it would not be me who makes these decisions. And I was going to say it's for better or worse. I think it's for better.
Right.
You don't want somebody to make that decision at 3 a.m.
Right.
holding a person's fate in their hands in a way that, which we do, right? But in a way that feels capricious, it's 3 a.m. decision doesn't make sense. No decisions are good at 3 a.m. and a decision about a person getting a life-saving intervention is the very worst. But so the way that, my understanding, and this is a work in progress throughout the country, but broadly, the way that these practices and sort of protocols work, my understanding is that there's and I don't know how it will end up unfolding at my hospital or in Boston or in Massachusetts specifically, but when people write about these sorts of ethical decisions, what they recommend is that there's kind of a set of criteria by which patients are ranked, really, in a way that's not dissimilar from a transplant list. People are ranked both by the need that they have for the intervention or the organ, and then also the likelihood that they'll benefit from it, that they will live to hospital discharge and beyond. And so I think that in many rankings is a key criteria. We're not just going to use a ventilator to support somebody for 24 hours. Is this somebody who is sick enough to need it and well enough otherwise so that there's a chance that they can get out of the hospital? And so there will be some, these protocols that exist and that have existed even before coronavirus kind of put that into the equation. How this is actually, and many writers on this also say that there should be a quote unquote sort of triage officer, like somebody who's not the bedside doctor who's implementing these things. How that actually feels, that's what I was trying to understand as I was writing, because even if you're not the person making the decision, this person is your patient.
That's right.
And I still think it must feel a way that I never want to feel. You know, as a doctor, you are used to making the best decision for your patient. We don't generally make decisions with the good of the broader public in mind. I don't say, I'm not going to give you this antibiotic because we might be running short. No, I say I'm going to give you this antibiotic. It's the right antibiotic for you. And so the idea that we would be carrying forward decisions that are really for the good of the public and not necessarily the individual is a challenge, and you know, something that I hope does not come to pass. And I am so sad for my colleagues in places where it will come to pass.
But it sounds like it will. It sounds like this moment will put doctors in a position which is, as you said, tremendously uncomfortable, because you usually work for the benefit of a particular individual patient, not making a choice between a very able 50-year-old and perhaps a less able 80-year-old. And in that way, I was saying earlier, the work you have done before the virus, in a way, might inform the way you will practice now that the virus is amongst us. And just a few days ago, I spoke, Daniela, with a philosopher who teaches at the New School in New York, who spent a lot of time thinking about death and dying. After all, Socrates said that to philosophize is to learn how to die. And he said that this moment is a very philosophical moment. And I'm wondering how that resonates for you. I have a feeling it might. It's a different way of putting it is that it is a moment where certain priorities are coming into the foreground. Perhaps a certain way of looking at our medical establishment is coming to the foreground. It's posing deep ethical questions. And I'm wondering how you might respond to these queries.
I think we're all under threat, and for me personally, there is this kind of real, and I vacillate between actually kind of recognizing this and ignoring this, but this real loss of, you know, some pseudo invincibility that I had of, yeah, you know, I go through my day and not really any risk of anything, and I can kind of do what I want. You know, I can see my family when I want. They live in Miami. I can fly there. I can, I spent the fall and summer flying back and forth from Boston to LA for something. And like, you know, you have the idea that you can sort of just craft things as you want. And this stopped that. I mean, everyone has stopped. And I think that in that way, when you're focusing on a single goal, which is this invisible sort of threat that we are all facing, there's something, it feels like there should be something crystallizing about it. I'm not sure what exactly has crystallized for me. So I think if it's a philosophical moment, I can feel what that means, but I'm not sure what conclusion comes from that, at least for me.
You wrote that you worry that unless we find some way to mitigate the overwhelming isolation this virus has created, we will leave a fleet of wounded patients and family survivors in its wake. Speak to me about that, because that sentence of yours also, I must say, Daniela, haunted me.
Yeah, so, you know, I've been very interested before coronavirus in what happens to people who survive critical illness, and not just somebody who's, you know, I'm not saying just like it is small, but not somebody who is in the ICU for a day recovering from a procedure. Somebody who has been sick enough to need a ventilator for at least sort of a couple of days. And these are patients I've taken care of for years now, and for a long time had simply felt victorious when they left the ICU, even if they left looking and seeming nothing like how they came in. I thought, you know, we did a great job. They were a success, which is defined by being alive in my head at that time. And then became interested in, what were people's long-term outcomes. And we know that people who survive critical illness have something that we call post-intensive care syndrome. So anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and cognitive dysfunction in a decent percentage. Not all, not nearly all, less than half. But it exists. And so, I wonder about, in the setting of coronavirus, with families separated from patients, with patients' doctors wearing, quite clear, visible barriers between them, whether these outcomes, both for the patients and then the somewhat similar outcomes that are described for families, are going to be worse, particularly for patients who don't do well.
Right.
And the families, because they can't be, haven't been there. I mean, that has to leave some mark. And so I wonder about that, about what will be the kind of ripples and repercussions, even when the active threat is no longer as present as it is now.
Do you feel that this calamity of this virus might? I mean, are you hopeful, or do you believe that we have reason to be hopeful that the way the public might be insured, and the way in which maybe medicine will be practiced after this virus passes in the US might change, and maybe might change for the better? Or differently put, what are your hopes?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that we don't, when this fades, I think everything ends at some point. When this fades, I hope that we don't just go back to normal. I mean, in some ways, I hope that we go back to normal. I do enjoy restaurants,
right?
Going out to drinks, but I hope that from the one thing that has come of this is that there's been tremendous innovation really quickly. I mean, people who had no remote practices have been seeing patients, in telemedicine. So they've set up entire telemedicine practices, which is things that would take people like a year to do, or they would maybe not even do it. And I hope that we stop bringing people into the office if they don't need to be brought in. I hope that medicine does acknowledge that there is danger in the hospital. Maybe it's not coronavirus, but the hospital is not necessarily the best place for anyone to be. And it's definitely not convenient for a lot of people. And so I hope that some of these innovations that are born of this sort of, tragic necessity, that they remain. I hope that we learn a lesson about preparedness. That's kind of, I can hope for it, but I also could see a world where it doesn't happen. But I do hope that we learn a lesson about the fact that we need to be ready for things that seem entirely implausible. I mean, I remember sometime in February, a friend of mine was tracking coronavirus in Wuhan and telling me the numbers every day. And he was worried, and I just couldn't imagine a world in which this actually threatened us. I was wrong, obviously. But I think being ready for these possibilities, and by ready, I mean crazy to me that we don't have the PPE that we need. It's crazy to me that we don't have a sufficient number of ventilators. So ready in those ways, I hope that will also change. And I don't know, from the family in the hospital perspective, I think that we understand its value, and I think that when this threat is over, they will come back in, and I hope that we will have found by then ways, really reliable, good ways to keep people involved when they can't be here.
I can't tell you what a pleasure it's been to speak to you, and I hope that when all of this passes, you and I will meet in person. But
that would be lovely.
Thank you so much, and all the best, and I hope the weeks ahead at your hospital will go as smoothly as we can possibly imagine or hope for.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hope you stay well too.
Thank
all
you.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.